And we are thrilled to be joined now by Fox Sports lead game analyst Joel Klatt, who will be calling that huge game between Indiana and Ohio State on Saturday. Joel, I want to start with the injury news from early this week with Seth McLaughlin now out for Ohio State. Their starting center, who had transferred from Alabama, was having such a good year. The second offensive line injury of the season for the Buckeyes. How significant is this one?
This is the one guy I don't think that they could lose. I think that it is much bigger than people realize. We tend to, in the public, minimize offensive line injuries because, one, we don't know these guys as well as the stars on the outside. They don't touch the ball. But on the inside of these programs, they'll tell you exactly who the guys are that make them tick. And Seth was one of those guys for Ohio State. And more specifically, Rev, because of the injury to Simmons earlier in the year. Remember, their left tackle to start the year, Simmons, he gets hurt against Oregon. And then they had to shuffle around and find a new combination on the offensive line. And they found one that was very dominant against Penn State and has played well since. They inserted Carson Hinsman, last year's center, at left guard and moved All-American left guard Donovan Jackson out to left tackle. That worked because of Seth McLaughlin and Donovan Jackson. So Hinsman didn't have to worry about the calls or the snap or anything. He just got to go play and be physical. And they would say that, like, hey, the whole key to this thing is Seth McLaughlin. So the fact that he's not going to be in there, I think, is a monumental issue for Ohio State's offense. And in particular, to happen kind of midweek when the game plan has already been installed, you don't have time to get the backup, whoever they play at center, time to get him a significant amount of reps in practice, ready to go for a top 5 matchup. I think that this is a massive deal, and that's exactly where I'll be focused early in the game. I can tell you this right now, Rev, on the first 10, 15 snaps of the game, those interior 3 offensive linemen are all I'm going to be watching.
Interesting. Yeah, it's fascinating. You think about that Nebraska game, like it took them a while to get going with that offensive line combination, right? They didn't play well with
and
that
Rev,
group
they
initially.
didn't have that combination yet.
Yeah.
You know, they only switched to what I just explained for Penn State.
Yeah, right, to figure it out. Yep.
So they tried to throw in, who was it? not Seth McLaughlin, but there was Maholsky.
And then he got hurt.
They tried to throw in, and then he got hurt. And so, like, this has been a huge, basically shuffling around until they landed on this that has worked, and now they're going to have to reshuffle.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be fascinating to watch that. We were talking last week, and I asked you kind of in advance of this game because I was so anxious to get to it. Don't normally ask you about a game a week before it happens. But I was talking about, hey, where's an area where Indiana can compete? Where do they have an advantage? You talked about Curtis Rourke, how great he is on the back shoulder throws. Yep. So let me flip that. What's the area that will give Indiana the most problems against Ohio State?
Well, the defensive line is active and athletic, and they can produce pressure. Now, we can argue that they may have not gotten the sack production that we hoped that they would have for Ohio State, but they're disruptive. We know that, and they are active up front. And when you look at the one half of football where I would say Indiana struggled offensively, it was in their last game against Michigan. And when you watch that film, Rev, what jumps out to you is that they struggled up front against that very good defensive line for the Michigan Wolverines. That threw off the entire timing of the offense. They couldn't run the ball very effectively, and even the RPO style stuff, it was tough on Rourke because the pressure was in his face. So he was uncomfortable and off rhythm for one of the first times all season long. That's exactly what Ohio State is going to have to try to mimic, is what Michigan was able to do in the second half against the Hoosiers. Now, can they do that? Probably, because even if they don't have the sack numbers, they have the pressure numbers with Sawyer and Tuimoloau and the interior guys, Tyleik Hamilton and Ty Hamilton and Tyleik Williams. These guys can play now. And they've got some depth at that position, and then they've also incorporated more blitzing, and in particular blitzing from the safety position and Caleb Downs. That's where I think Ohio State has got to be great, is affecting Rourke and making him feel their presence and get him off schedule.
I want to talk a little bit about the psychology of this game, Joel. And it's one thing, the brands. Like, I get it with Indiana. I mean, some of the stats are staggering, right? They're 1-70 all time against top 5 programs. They've lost 44 in a row. The last win came before either of us were born, and I'm kind of old. So all that being said, like, I get that part of it. But none of that really impacts these current players. But what does impact these current players is there's no one on Indiana's team who's ever played in a game like this.
Right.
There are a lot of guys on Ohio State's team. In fact, the entire team has, as recently as a month ago, against Penn State and against Oregon, right? I mean, these guys know what it is to play in big games.
Yeah.
How important do you think that is? Brands aside, school aside, how important is it for those individuals?
So there's two teams in college football this year that have had to play top 5 matchups twice. Now, it just so happens that each of those teams had to do it on the road. Georgia went to Alabama and struggled in the first half, right? I mean, well, we watched that game. Bama ended up winning the game. Now, Georgia played well in the second half, but they struggled in their first outing in a top 5 matchup of the season. And Georgia's a team littered with people and players, more specifically, that have experience in big moments. And even they, on the road for the first time in a top 5 environment this season, really struggled in the first half. Then you look at Ohio State. They also had to go on the road in a top 5 matchup and face Oregon. They lost the game. Georgia lost the one against Alabama. And these are teams that are I would say, very experienced in these types of situations. They expect to be in these situations, but these environments are different. They just are. The pressure is different. Everything about it feels different. And as a player, there are times when you walk out there and like, I don't feel anything below my knee. You know, like I don't feel my feet. I feel like I'm floating. My heart is racing, and those moments can't be replicated in practice. And that's something that Indiana is going to have to deal with for the very first time. And even the most experienced teams at the top end of college football, like Ohio State and Georgia, they even struggled in their first outing in a top 5 matchup on the road this season. Now, they got better, and each of them then, remember, Georgia went to Texas and won. Ohio State went to Penn State and won. But this is Indiana's first chance. So how do they play? History would suggest it's going to take them a little while to get their feet wet.
Fascinated to see that part of it. What do you think Indiana needs to do to stay in the college football playoff picture? Let's assume they beat Purdue.
Yeah.
Let's assume they beat Purdue. So what do they need to do here against Ohio State to remain in that group that gets into the bracket?
So I bristle at this like narrative and even line of questioning, because this idea that they have to do something, they're undefeated. And Rev, you know, like, why isn't this same standard being applied to Notre Dame, which lost to Northern Illinois?
Look, you're preaching to the choir. You're preaching the choir.
No,
I'm just living in reality.
I'm also saying
I'm living in reality.
To the viewer.
Yeah, I'm
not mad at the question.
Right.
This is an answer to your question. Why isn't that standard, you know, on Tennessee, who lost to Arkansas, or Ole Miss, who lost to Kentucky, or Alabama, which lost to Vanderbilt? This team has not lost. And Rev, think about this too. Think about this. Yeah, they may not have played a great schedule, but they have been more dominant against their schedule than anybody in the country. Yep. Look at their average margin of victory. You know, so that's why I bristle at it a little bit. And then you come to this thought that nobody can lose a game at this point. Only Oregon is probably the team that you would just kind of put into the playoff. They're already in the Big Ten championship game. So even if they were to stumble against Washington and lose the Big Ten championship game, they would probably still go to the playoff. They're the only one that can probably survive a loss. Nobody else can survive a loss. Penn State can't survive a loss, not at this point. Notre Dame can't lose to Army, not at this point. So I think that Indiana is similar to everybody else, but I also just would suggest to people that this team doesn't control their schedule, and the players have gone out there and all they can do is dominate the teams in front of them, and they've done that to a greater degree than anybody else has all season long.
Won by 30 points per game, best scoring margin of any team in the country. Should be a fascinating game and a great scene for Big Noon on Saturday. Look forward to hearing your call. Thanks, Joel.
Rev, I've always appreciated it, man. Thank you.